Good evening, I'm Andrew Chang. Adrian is away. Tonight, a big promise for Canadians off the job.
We will continue to be there.
Ottawa will extend emergency benefits, but for how long and for how many people? In the U.S., another family left grieving, another call for justice.
We are angry. When does it stop?
Atlanta's mayor promises change after a black man is shot and killed by police. A landmark decision.
It's huge, and it's a major step forward and in the right direction.
The U.S. Supreme Court guarantees protections for gay and transgender workers. And the slow-motion tragedy inside long-term care homes.
I wish that I'd never put her there.
Families describe confusion, chaos, and neglect.
He said, "I love you," and then he said, "water." And that was his last words.
Their demand for answers and calls for change. This is The National. 3 months into Canada's COVID-19 crisis, and we are starting to see cautious relief as case numbers drop. But there's also a growing anxiety as financial worries mount. Now, so far, it's still largely government aid keeping Canada's economy on the rails. Some $43.5 billion has already been paid out through the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. 8.4 million people receive it. Hundreds of thousands more apply for it each week. But it was only guaranteed for 4 months. Well, today, the government said the CERB will be extended. David Cochran starts our coverage tonight with the economics and the politics of that decision.
It's been a stressful but a manageable couple of months for me because of CERB.
Rebecca Gray is one of more than 8 million Canadians who rely on the CERB. Before the pandemic, she worked 5 jobs, mostly teaching, singing, or performing in front of a live audience. It's the type of work that's slow to come back from COVID, and Gray's benefits run out next month.
So honestly, my job prospects have not improved, so it's still a very scary time.
Prime Minister Trudeau needs to provide a plan.
Jagmeet Singh says that plan has to include a CERB extension, or the NDP won't support the minority Liberals in Parliament, making one lifeline contingent on another.
This is fundamental for us moving forward.
If you're having troubles finding a job, you shouldn't also be worrying about whether you'll hit the limit of your CERB benefits.
The Prime Minister tried to reassure people like Rebecca Gray, promising an extension. Those specifics are still being negotiated.
We'll have more details later this week, but for today, I want you to know that we will continue to be there for you and your family.
So the CERB will continue in some form while the country inches towards normal. Another challenge is that companies have been reluctant to use the federal wage subsidy, which the government hoped will get Canadians off the CERB, which has Trudeau almost pleading for employers to sign up.
Please use the wage subsidy if you haven't already. This help is designed for you and your employees.
The Liberals face a confidence vote in Parliament on Wednesday, so political pressure is one reason for this move. The bigger reason is that the economy is still sputtering and millions don't have jobs to go back to. David Cochran, CBC News, Ottawa.
As for the pandemic itself, the situation's still serious, but every day the peak gets a little smaller in the rearview mirror. Across the country, fewer than 30,000 COVID-19 cases are still active, most in Quebec and Ontario. But even there are far more daily recoveries than new infections. In Quebec today, 102 new COVID cases, but almost 5 times as many recoveries at 471. Ontario saw 181 new infections, while twice as many people, 262, were cleared of the virus. And more parts of Ontario are entering phase 2 of reopening this Friday. But 3 major regions, including Toronto, will have to keep waiting. That's left some people feeling confused, frustrated, and questioning the provincial plan. Vicadopia explains.
A pandemic tale of 2 cities. On one side of the street, Vaughan, where businesses will welcome customers back on Friday. On the other, Toronto, where nothing changes for this Thai restaurant or anyone else.
It's very unfortunate because we are a 5-minute walk away from being able to open the patio.
Indeed, if you don't like the closures in Toronto, just cross the street. It's a problem Ontario's premier acknowledges.
We ask you, please be patient, because we can't let our guard down.
Just 3 regions account for 3/4 of COVID-19 cases: Windsor, Toronto, and neighboring Peel, which includes Mississauga and Brampton. They remain closed, except for essential services.
Up in North Bay, there was very few cases. Why are we being punished for Toronto? And I heard it from Kenora and other regions, rural areas that didn't have the cases. So we agreed.
While British Columbia reopened at the same pace province-wide, Alberta and Quebec kept hotspots closed longer.
This is a bit of an experiment, and we'll see how it goes in Ontario.
This infectious disease specialist says Ontario could shut down again if the province can't nail down the source of new infections.
It is worrisome, though, that you have a number of cases where you don't know where it came from, because that's concerning, because how do you bring in control measures if you don't know where it actually came from? So that will be a number that's very important to watch as we reopen things further.
News of all of Ontario reopening could come as soon as the end of next week. Until then, people are being urged to not overwhelm other places that have opened. Vic Adopia, CBC News, Toronto.
Starting on Thursday, Ontario will begin to gradually allow visitors into long-term care homes and senior residences. But there are restrictions aimed at stopping new outbreaks. Ellen Morrow spoke to some who feel they go too far.
I'm standing outside the window now.
Dr. Nathan Stahl is a seniors care specialist, but he can't care for his own grandmother. In a seniors home, hope often scarce.
The last 3 months?
Yes.
I was getting ready to die.
Stahl fears Ontario's new visitation guidelines will do little to help lift seniors' spirits.
These are very precious and limited moments, and I'm really fearful of what families are missing. It's really too overly restrictive and a little bit cruel.
The guidelines say residents of COVID-free long-term care homes will be allowed one outdoor-only visit with one person from a distance at least once a week. The length of time can be limited by the home. The visitor will have to have tested negative for COVID-19 in the previous 14 days.
To work at my hospitals, I don't need to go and get a regular COVID test.
Dr. Samir Sinha says the rules should be reconsidered for family members who provide care when homes have failed to do so.
A lot of people are going to die of loneliness and isolation, and the fact that they're not actually getting care at the levels their families and friends were providing before, than just of COVID, if we keep actually putting these restrictions up.
Are you doing okay?
After months of lockdown, Sandy Brown is desperate for a proper visit with her mother, Doreen.
If we could just go and take them for more walks and stuff, it would be better for them.
But with fears of a second wave, some say this level of caution is prudent.
Being in the throes of a outbreak and seeing what that ravages that did, I'm well aware that we wouldn't be able to tolerate another one.
It's so disheartening.
Anil Reddy had an early visit with his 93-year-old mother. She's going blind, so with a mask and from a distance, she didn't know it was him.
Right now, she thinks she's been forgotten. She doesn't know she's loved. I want that to change.
Today, he got tested to see her again soon. Ellen Morrow, CBC News, Toronto.
And later on The National, we speak to people who lost loved ones in those long-term care homes.
I wish that I'd never put her there. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to get over that. It's like a nightmare.
They have crushing stories of care that fell short and frustration they still feel. Their calls for lasting change coming up in about 20 minutes. Well, China has a new outbreak of COVID-19 with more than 100 cases confirmed in Beijing. The city had gone weeks with no reported cases at all, but now under threat of a second wave. The big question is where it came from. Christine Burak looks into it.
The outbreak is believed to have started inside this giant wholesale food market in Beijing. It's now closed, but the market's manager says the virus was traced back to a cutting board used by a retailer who sells imported salmon from Europe. It's now being pulled from all grocery store shelves. Widespread testing is underway, and parts of the city are now locked down. This resident says, "Of course I'm worried. I take the bus. I don't even want to work now." Chinese health authorities say they're still looking into the source of this infection, but not everyone's convinced that European salmon is to blame.
The origin and extent of the outbreak are being investigated.
The World Health Organization has said the virus that causes COVID-19 in humans is not known to infect aquatic food animals nor contaminate their products. If not from eating it, there's also speculation the virus hitched a ride on the packaging the fish was shipped in.
I will be reticent to be in a position where all packaging and other things would need to be systematically tested. I think we need to look at what has happened in this case. I don't believe it's the primary hypothesis, but it needs to be explored.
We don't actually know what the source of this infection is.
Researchers say they're waiting for China to publish the virus's genetic sequence. Like a fingerprint, it'll show if someone in China brought the virus into the market or if it arrived from Europe.
We would expect to see some transparency when the genetic sequence is available so that the rest of the world has access to that.
The science will hopefully reveal whether this is a case of global finger pointing or a new threat. Christine Burak, CBC News, Toronto.
In the United States, a possible treatment for COVID-19, one touted by President Trump, has been revoked by the FDA. It's rescinded the emergency authorization for hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, two malaria drugs they now say are unlikely to be effective in treating the virus. In fact, officials say they could pose a greater risk to patients that would outweigh any potential benefits. The U.S. Supreme Court delivered a major decision today that surprised some people. The country's top judges used a landmark ruling from the civil rights era and applied it to fight workplace discrimination against LGBT people. Katie Simpson has more from Washington.
In the era of COVID, a subdued celebration at the Supreme Court to mark a monumental victory for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans.
It's huge, and it's a major step forward and in the right direction for this entire LGBTQ community.
As a gay American, it's just shocking to me to think that in so many states around the country before today, I could still be fired for being gay.
In a 6-3 decision, the court ruled the Civil Rights Act of 1964 applies to sexual orientation and gender identity because the law prohibits discrimination based on sex. It now means an employee can't be fired for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender.
I've read the decision, and some people were surprised, but they've ruled, and we live with their decision. That's what it's all about. We live with the decision of the Supreme Court. Very powerful, a very powerful decision, actually.
The surprise in this ruling is that two conservative justices, including the Chief Justice and Neil Gorsuch, who was appointed by U.S. President Donald Trump, sided with their liberal colleagues. The justices in dissent argued the court was amending the law rather than interpreting it because it was originally meant to ensure men and women are treated equally in the workplace.
It affirms our humanity. It really does.
This transgender activist says American attitudes are changing. She cried when she saw the massive turnout in New York this weekend at a Black Trans Lives Matter protest.
The movement for equality is not over. Discrimination is still legal in public accommodations, in housing, for credit, for schools, for adoption. But this decision by the Supreme Court is a signal that things are going to move in the right direction.
Pride parades and demonstrations have widely been canceled this summer because of COVID-19. The court's ruling gives the LGBT community something to celebrate, to unite and come together over at a time when people can't be together. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
Well, there were emotional appeals today from the family of Rayshard Brooks, a black man shot by a white police officer in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. As Susan Ormiston tells us, Brooks' relatives don't just want justice, they want change. And a warning, there's video in this story that you may find disturbing.
How many more protests will it take to ensure that the next victim isn't your cousin, your brother?
Another family grieving after a black man was shot in the back by Atlanta police.
No one walking this green earth expects to be shot and killed like trash in the street for falling asleep in a drive-thru.
Rayshard Brooks.
Oh, I'm a man.
27, was woken up by police after nodding off in his car at a Wendy's drive-thru. They talked for 20 minutes and apparently cooperatively.
Blah, 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 stop.
But Brooks failed his breathalyzer.
Put your hands on your butt.
When the cuffs came out, he battled, grabbing an officer's taser and running. A security camera shows police in pursuit. Brooks pointed the taser, then turned, and an officer shot him twice in the back. A third bullet, says an attorney, hit one of the cars lined up to get a burger.
People ask, how could this have ended? Why did he resist? It could have ended there. Well, it also could have ended here. I can walk. My sister's house is right here.
Brooks had offered to park and walk. His death brought protests to the streets again today. Atlanta's mayor promised immediate reforms on deadly use of force.
We saw the worst happen on Friday night with Mr. Brooks.
As another family shouldered their loss.
We're going to have to bury him. We're going to have to say, we miss you. We got to apologize to him for not telling him that we loved him that much.
I just want y'all to know that y'all took my cousin from me.
Prosecution, if charges come, will turn on whether that deadly force was lawful and justified, given options to de-escalate that situation. President Trump is expected to sign an executive order tomorrow on police reform. No comfort for another family in Atlanta tonight. Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Washington.
In New Brunswick, the premier is acknowledging systemic racism in the wake of the death of Rodney Levi, an Indigenous man shot and killed by the RCMP. Blaine Higgs announced he'll scrap a controversial bill to increase emergency powers of government and police.
I think Friday night changed things for a lot of people, and including myself. We certainly have to recognize the challenges we're having here in our province, the systematic racism that seems to be part of our society and has been for generations.
Levi's death came just 8 days after Chantel Moore, an Indigenous woman, was killed by police during a wellness check. Both shootings are now under investigation. Montreal's mayor, meantime, acknowledged today the city has a problem with systemic racism. This after nearly 2 years of investigation. Today, the result came, and as Alison Northcott shows, so did potential fixes.
Equality should not be like pulling teeth.
A citizen-led initiative pushed the city to take a closer look at systemic racism and discrimination. 7,000 participated. Now, Montreal's public consultation office found the city turned a blind eye to the issues.
What we're saying is that if you don't know what you're fighting against, how can you effectively evaluate the actions that you're putting forward?
She says the city has taken little action around issues involving policing, racial profiling, and employment. Over a 3-year period, the report found no one who identified as a visible minority, ethnic minority, or Indigenous was hired in upper management at the City of Montreal. Among the sweeping recommendations, anti-racism training for the entire municipal civil service, a policy declaring racial and social profiling by police violate Montrealers' fundamental rights, and the top recommendation to publicly recognize the systemic nature of racism.
Systemic racism does exist.
Montreal Mayor Valérie Plante said she will act and appoint a commissioner to counter racism.
We want to make sure there's more representation within the public servants.
Quebec's premier announced a new task force on racism, but continued to deny it's a systemic problem.
My definition of systemic racism is that there's a system in Quebec of racism, and I don't think that there's a system.
But the head of the Native Women's Shelter says the list of systemic issues facing Indigenous people in Montreal is long.
Youth protection, the hospitals, the police, the court system, right? Potentially they'll be able to address these issues because we need the help.
We need Montrealers to be reflected in our institutions.
Now many want to see action, concrete steps and ways to measure them to ensure they're actually working. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
Well, there is outrage tonight after a U.S.-Canadian citizen was sentenced to prison in Russia for spying. Next on The National, why his family believes he was set up. Also later, European travel resumes with long lines, confusion, and concern.
When you go through security, you could tell the staff were really stressed.
And the tragedy unfolding inside long-term care homes. 3 families share the stories of the loved ones they lost.
I wish that I'd never put her there. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to get over that.
Their grief and determination to find accountability. We're back in 2 minutes. Well, Canada says it's deeply concerned, and the United States is, quote, outraged after a dual citizen was sentenced by a Russian court to 16 years in a maximum security prison. Paul Whelan is accused of espionage, but as Chris Brown explains, some are calling him a political hostage.
Even though he couldn't understand the verdict,
nothing's translated, Your Honor. I don't know what you said.
Paul Whelan knew guilty was always the likely outcome. He called it a sham trial.
It is what it is.
Held in secret. Western observers saw it that way too.
It's a mockery of justice. I can't say I'm surprised.
Though he was based in the United States, Ottawa-born Whelan holds citizenship in 4 countries, including Canada. Global Affairs said the severity of the sentence, 16 years, clearly illustrates that Russia is using its judicial system as a political tool. Whelan, a former U.S. Marine working as a security consultant, visited Russia often, and he liked it enough to bring his parents on a visit. He claims in December 2018 at a wedding in an upscale Moscow hotel, an acquaintance gave him a USB stick with what Whelan says he thought were holiday photos. Turns out that friend really worked for Russia's secret police, and Whelan was arrested for stealing state secrets. His brother David, who lives outside of Toronto, believes Paul was set up.
It's a common thing that we're seeing, though, now. We're seeing it in China with Mr. Kovig and Mr. Spavor. We're seeing it in Egypt and Iran. We're seeing foreigners captured, and these countries who cannot get things done diplomatically otherwise are holding foreigners as hostages, as political pawns.
Russian officials have frequently demanded the United States release convicted Russian smuggler Konstantin Yaroshenko and arms dealer Victor Bout. Whelan's lawyer talked up the possibility of such a swap as he left court. This is generally accepted practice, he said. There is always an exchange. There is the remote possibility of a successful appeal, but if not, Whelan, who's 50 years old and in frail health, will likely serve his long sentence in a Russian prison factory. Chris Brown, CBC News, Vancouver.
Filipino journalist Maria Ressa says she will not stop fighting after being convicted for libel in a case that's drawn global concern about press freedom in the Philippines.
Freedom of the press is the foundation of every single right you have as a Filipino citizen. This kind of gray area where if you go too far, you'll get slammed. Let's not play the game. Are we a democracy or not? Let us do our jobs.
Ressa's conviction is over a 2012 story which accused a Philippine businessman of ties to murder, drugs, and human trafficking. She faces up to 6 years in prison. Her lawyers say they will appeal the verdict. Well, CBC News investigation into rail safety has found troubling problems involving trains carrying crude oil. In the 7 years since Lac Mégantic, other communities have been threatened by derailments. And as Dave Seglins tells us, one line in Saskatchewan has a particularly bad track record.
This is the train derailment. Right at the end of the driveway, it's 2 o'clock in the morning.
Melanie Loso couldn't believe her eyes. A CP freight train carrying crude oil derailed just steps from her family's home.
My grandchildren were crying. They were very upset.
Less than 2 months later, just kilometers away, a second train derailed.
And I was just like, oh my God, not again. This is just too much.
CBC obtained government inspection reports. Over the last 5 years, Transport Canada found hundreds of problems along this track. We showed the findings to a leading rail expert.
It was pretty bad from end to end. Really bad shape, I'd say.
Naish says Transport Canada should have cracked down on CP Rail.
They didn't take any action to say, okay, guys, you got to stop operating on this line until you fix things.
CP Rail this spring is back doing major upgrades. Despite last winter's crashes, the railway says its Saskatchewan line was properly maintained. In Lac Mégantic, 47 people died when an oil train derailed. Since then, there have been 7 more major crashes involving crude oil. all caused by track problems. Bruce Campbell wrote a book on Lac-Mégantic.
I'm concerned that the lessons of Lac-Mégantic don't seem to be taken into account. What's at stake is the safety of the public. It's people's lives.
Transport Canada insists it has a robust track oversight program, but in a statement it acknowledges track issues remain an all too common cause of main track derailments. This spring it ordered rail companies to come up with tougher standards, almost 7 years after Canada's worst ever oil train disaster. Dave Seglin, CBC News, Toronto.
And when we come back, the stories of loved ones lost in long-term care, their final days locked away in fear.
He said, "I love you," and then he said, "water." And that was his last words.
3 families share their grief and their shock in the hopes of changing the system. Some pretty unsettling questions emerge when we see who's been killed by COVID-19 in Canada. Of more than 8,000 deaths, CBC News has linked 6,400 to long-term care facilities or senior residences. That's nearly 4 of every 5 lives lost. We've all seen images of substandard care and heartbreaking separation from those who might have helped them hang on. And more than statistics, they were human beings. They were our siblings, our parents, our grandparents, who left a mark on what they built and who they loved. Now, some of those loved ones have told Ioana Remiliotis about their dismal care and final days spent in fear and incredible need. And a question, can something good come out of the heartache of a devastated generation?
He was a good person. He didn't deserve to die like that. Nobody deserves to die like that.
Such a beautiful person.
This loss is all the more haunting because of what else is missing.
I love you.
Peace. There's no peace with this ending.
You put your loved one in a home, counting on them to take care of your loved one. It's just terrible. It's inhuman.
Bob Toms, his family says, was a gentle soul, a retired building engineer who battled cancer and then dementia.
He was our older brother. He was amazing. He made everybody feel special.
Now he's one of the faces of a decimated generation. Susan Hines and Bill Toms are convinced their brother never had a fighting chance. It's why they're fighting for him now.
He died without dignity. He died without care. He died without his family. Amen.
That breaks my heart.
Bob lived here at Extendicare Guildwood in Toronto's East End. The long-term care facility has been in lockdown since mid-March. On April 23rd, it reported an outbreak of COVID-19.
I called them off the hook. Off the hook. Like I probably drove them nuts. I wanted to make sure they were giving him water.
Feeding him.
Staff assured them Bob was okay. When the home began to allow window visits last month, Susan and Bill rushed over.
We saw somebody that I didn't recognize in a hospital bed.
How did he look?
Skin on bone. There was nothing there. Just mouth agape, wanting to communicate, but maybe not having the strength to. Like he's moving and making gestures, but I don't think he had any strength to do anything.
They took these disturbing photos and say when they called out through the window for help, a staff member told them their brother had been turning down food and water.
I said, I want to see him not be able to drink. And they went and got him a glass of water, and he drank a glass and a half of water. He was looking at me, trying to tell me something. Then he'd look at them and think, like, what do you... It looked to me like he was very surprised that they were giving them the water.
It was a revealing glimpse into a home in crisis. To date, the vast majority of the 159 residents at Guildwood have been infected, and nearly 50 residents have died from the virus. Michelle Wilson's father was one of them. Her grief is overwhelming, so is her outrage.
If this had happened in a school and it was children dying, there would have been an uproar. How do we allow this? How do we have so little regard and respect for our seniors?
David Johnson's life had been full of adventure,
As a young man, he worked on merchant ships in his native Trinidad before coming to Canada, where he settled into the hospitality industry.
He was creative, he was ambitious, he was determined, he was strong.
David moved to Guildwood after a series of strokes and a broken hip. He was doing well, and then COVID hit.
When you heard about COVID being in your dad's home, what went through your mind?
Panic. Panic, because obviously it's everyone's worst nightmare for anyone that we love to be locked into a facility where there are cases, and you're reliant on their efforts and their expertise to contain it.
What did they say they were doing in terms of infection control?
They said that they were isolating the infected from the uninfected, that they were containing it to the east wing, and my father was in the west wing.
Her father was in a private room, presumably even safer. Michelle and her siblings kept calling to check up on him. The phone would just keep ringing.
We learned afterwards that it was because their staff was getting infected, and so they were short-staffed, and we were trying to be sympathetic and patient and cooperative, but it just reached a point where we realized that no, something's cracking here. Something's not functioning properly in the management of this outbreak.
When did that moment come for you? When did that point come?
The shocking realization was when I did the window visit. He was unresponsive. He didn't turn to me. He didn't acknowledge me. And then I heard him coughing. And no one was in the room. And I had to call someone in the room that I saw walking by, at which point they checked him. And they're like, no, he's just tired. He's fine.
But he wasn't fine. Michelle and her siblings insisted they be allowed inside on palliative grounds. When Michelle saw her father up close, he had sores on his arm and his lips were cracked.
At which point I got the sponge and wet it and put it in his mouth. He really grasped onto it. He wouldn't let it go. He was really sucking all the water out of the sponge that he could get. I did a few more of that. And then I said to him, "Dad, I love you." And he said, "I love you." And then he said, "Water." And that was his last words.
The despair of those final moments. They are the crosses families now bear. And in this shared grief, a growing demand for answers and accountability.
They're not dispensable. Like, there are loved ones.
Exactly.
Susan and Michelle are suing the home for neglect. Audrey DeCruz is taking legal action too.
They had a duty of care. They should have had adequate staff before.
Audrey took care of her 86-year-old mother, Teresa, for 4.5 years before her mobility worsened and she needed 24-hour care. Born in India, Audrey says her mother was a young widow who worked in factories here to provide for her daughters.
She never really bought things for herself. She would spend all her money for things that we needed.
Teresa moved in a day before the lockdown. She had her own phone and on a chat in late April told her daughter her roommates were ill, but that she was okay. 2 weeks later, Teresa got a fever. When the home called to tell Audrey, that was the first time she learned about the outbreak that had started weeks before.
The hardest part was not knowing that it was happening. I have no doubt in my mind that we would have gone there the very same day that we found out. I wouldn't have cared about whether she had a bed to go back to at that point. It was life and death. Obviously, we would have got her.
The home apologized for forgetting to add Audrey to a family email chain providing updates. She was also devastated to find out her mother's sick roommates were never moved out.
These people, they were sitting ducks. They could have built a structure in the parking lot and separated the positive and the negative people. If you can't stand beside someone in a grocery store line, how does it make sense to keep positive and negative seniors in a room together 24 hours a day.
We put the family's questions to the home. In statements, it says it can't speak publicly about specific residents, but says it has been updating families with regular emails and virtual town halls. And it says it is making changes to better manage the outbreak. Among them, it is now keeping sick and healthy residents apart. It's hired dozens of new staff and is deep cleaning the facility. What's more, the day-to-day management of the home is being handed over to a local health network until the outbreak is stabilized.
For Audrey, all that is too little, too late. She and her family are left with her mother's remains and the feeling that not only did the home fail to protect her, but that she did too.
I wish that I'd never put her there. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to get over that. It's like a nightmare.
Michelle says her father and all the residents who died deserved better.
They're throwing our seniors out like they're garbage. They're just dismissing them and disregarding them and acting like they don't matter. And they're old anyway, they're just gonna die anyway. Like, it's just a complete disregard for dignity, for care, for respect. It's appalling.
It's not my story, it's his story. And if it changes things for the better,
Yes, so be it.
that's what it's
Please.
about.
Please.
Let's change things so that our elderly
Are taken care
become visible people and not hidden.
For Susan and Bill, this is their day of mourning and a day of reckoning too, for all the lives left to end with so little grace. Joanna Remiliotis, CBC News, Toronto.
Tomorrow, David Common investigates the long-term care home in Ontario with the province's highest death toll. Problems had festered for years. Then, during the pandemic, families say they were discouraged from sending residents to hospital. Here's an excerpt.
I saw my dad. Yeah, he was very weak, wasn't able to even make eye contact, so I cut that call short and I called the nurses station and I told them that I needed him to be transported immediately.
The home relented, but at the hospital, Raquel is told her father's poor condition was not just because of the virus.
He was severely dehydrated and malnourished.
Do you feel today that Orchard Villa was invested in saving your dad's life?
It's a hard, really hard question. I can't say yes.
That's tomorrow night on The National. But coming up tonight, you're going to meet a pair of volunteers determined to bring some joy to seniors through the pandemic.
Like to see you.
You can see us.
Virtual visits with a therapy dog ahead in tonight's moment. And a little later, long lines as borders reopen in Europe, the confusion and concern as travel resumes. We'll be right back. COVID-19 has devastated families right across this country, especially those with relatives in long-term care in seniors' homes. CBC News is committed to honoring their memories through a series called Lives Remembered. Tonight, Debbie Upshaw shares her mother's story.
My name is Debbie Upshaw. My mother died of COVID-19. Her name was Evelina Upshaw, and she was 94 years young. Growing up and having Evelina as a mother was wonderful. It was hard too because Mommy was very protective over her children, especially her triplets. She tried to shelter us from so much in life, but she also made sure that we were happy in life as children. I had a great childhood. My mom worked very hard for her community because she knew, that we didn't have everything that every other area had. We live in Mulgrave Park and they didn't look highly upon us. I was with my mom in the end. I held her in my arms I didn't want to lose her. I wanted the Lord to take her home out of her suffering. So as I was holding her in my arms, I sang her a song, Precious Lord, Take Me Home, and Mommy took her last breath. My mother was Mother Upshaw, and she was named Queen of the Park. Her biggest legacy is going to be the breakfast program and the food bank. She loved that, and I love that memory, and everybody misses her. They're just waiting so we can have a celebration of life for her, so everyone can get together and enjoy the memories of my mom.
A big thank you to Debbie Upshaw for sharing that with us. If you've lost a loved one to COVID-19 and you'd like to share their story with us, send us an email to covid@cbc.ca. We're going to be right back with more news right here on The National. Some of the hardest hit European countries in the COVID crisis are now starting to reopen their borders cautiously. Italy, Spain, and France are among the nations loosening some travel restrictions within the EU. But as Renee Filipponi tells us, the lack of coordination is causing confusion.
After months of travel restrictions and closed borders, something new. Lineups at Berlin's airports this morning. European travel takes a tentative step forward. Safety measures are in place, but some are still anxious.
I was definitely a little bit nervous when I got into the airport, because like when you go through security, you could tell the staff were like really stressed.
It kind of seems to me that they open up really quickly because of like economy and that stuff.
At this France-Belgium land crossing, travelers arrived early. Many are French bargain hunters headed to Belgium for cheap cigarettes. It's half the price, says this woman, who drove 100 kilometers to save money. It's a complicated patchwork across Europe, with each country imposing its own timelines and rules about who is allowed to visit.
We call today a June 15 D-Day for tourism.
This representative of the tourism industry would have preferred a more coordinated pan-European approach.
The bubbles, the corridors, call it the bilateral, trilateral, multilateral agreements between countries are just adding more confusion and frustration.
In Italy, where borders have been open for more than a week, tourists have returned to Venice, amid protests by residents who worry things are happening too fast. As of today, Greece is welcoming tourists with a COVID-19 test on arrival. The Prime Minister wants to be cautious.
I'm not interested in making Greece the #1 destination in Europe. I'm interested in making Greece the safest destination in Europe.
Spain remains essentially closed for now, except for the island of Majorca, where a select number of German tourists are being allowed as a trial. They're basking in the sun, testing the waters of post-COVID travel. Renee Filipponi, CBC News, London.
Well, the moment is next. Tonight, it is bringing a moment of joy to seniors during the pandemic.
Pooch, can you say hi to your friend? Can you say hi to your friends?
A virtual visit with a therapy dog right after the break.
So I would go.
During the pandemic, when many seniors have been unable to see their loved ones in person, some of them have been getting virtual visits, and not just from relatives. They're meeting online with therapy dogs like Kuji. She's been keeping veterans at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto company, and that's tonight's moment.
Like to see you.
You can see us. We originally got Kuji to be a therapy dog. That's what they're bred for.
She's giving me a kiss back, Georgie. That's for you. A big lick for you.
It certainly is great to have the dog in the building.
I think you have to keep some form of normalcy through all this. You know, the veterans don't understand that, you know, we're in a wing that there is cognitive issues and Alzheimer's. They don't understand. So Kuji coming each week, you know, they may not fully comprehend that she's going to be there again next Wednesday. But, you know, coming each week, there's something that the dog gives them, and it's amazing, and you see it in their faces. Aw, thanks, Ness.
Unconditional love, that sense of normalcy that she mentioned. And staff say they've even noticed that after these sort of low-stakes visits, virtual visits with Coogee, that it's led to better virtual visits with family members the following day. That's pretty remarkable. That's The National for this June 15th. Have a good night.